Did you know that absolutely nowhere in any of Tolkien's writings did he ever describe Samwise Gamgee as fat? And he doesn't even imply it, like not even once. Maya Govan and Melanine, and welcome to another episode of Tolkien Untangled. In today's video, I'll be talking about a few common Middle-earth misconceptions, and realistically, going off on a few adjacent tangents. Now, if you've been following this channel for a while, then you'll probably know this isn't the first video that I've made on this topic. But since then, I've thought of a few more misconceptions that I want to add, starting with something that I feel very, very passionately about. Misconception number 1. Isildur was a bit of a dick. I've talked about this a few times before, but I couldn't possibly make a video about misconceptions without beginning on this point. Isildur did nothing wrong. He was a hero. He was a great man, and he should be remembered as such. Isildur was not corrupted. Say it with me, friends. The guy did nothing wrong. If you only take one thing away from this video, please let it be that you remember Isildur as more than just the douchebag who didn't destroy the ring, especially considering it would have been literally impossible for him to do so. Tolkien tells us, so great was the ring's power of lust, it was beyond the strength of any will, even Sauron's own, to injure it, cast it away, or neglect it. Elsewhere, he tells us, at the last moment the pressure of the ring would reach its maximum. Impossible, I should have said, for anyone to resist. The One Ring cannot be intentionally destroyed or even damaged, not by anyone, not even by Sauron. Of course, it's doubtful that either Elrond or Gandalf was aware of that fact when they came up with their plan to try and destroy the ring, but as I'm sure you'll recall, even incorruptible Frodo fails to destroy the ring at the very end. It seems his quest was to carry the One Ring to the Crack of Doom, but never to actually cast it into the fire. No one could ever do that. That result, of course, only comes about because of a trifecta of 3 distinct forces all interacting in the same moment. First, there's the fact that a little earlier in the story, Frodo cursed Gollum, using the power of the ring to declare, "If you touch me ever again, you shall be cast yourself into the fire of doom." When Gollum does touch Frodo again, he is indeed cast into the fire. Second, there is the fundamentally evil and treacherous nature of the ring itself. When it acquires a new bearer at the Crack of Doom, it immediately betrays him to his death. And finally, there's the design of Eru Ilúvatar himself, a compassionate god, indirectly nudging things in Middle-earth so that eventually all things shall prove but his instrument in the devising of a big climactic happy ending. A eucatastrophe is the word that Tolkien coined. And so, getting back to Isildur, in the absence of that trifecta, there's no way Isildur could have destroyed the ring. From the moment he took it, he was destined to either lose it, have it taken from him, or die with it. Even if there were a moment like that scene in the movies where Isildur goes with Elrond to the Crack of Doom, which does not happen in the book, there's no way that scene could have ended well. However, despite my enthusiastic appreciation for Isildur and how epic he is, he's the reason Gondor even has a white tree, by the way. Just because no one can destroy the One Ring does not necessarily mean Isildur did nothing wrong by choosing to keep it. Wise people told him not to, but he did do so anyway. And that is true, But there are a few more points that need to be made before we jump wholeheartedly back onto the Isildur was a bit of a dick bandwagon. Firstly, Isildur did not know what we know. With hindsight, it's very easy to say, well, if Isildur just destroyed the ring right at the end of the Second Age, the Third Age would have been a good time for everyone. But we're passing that judgment with full knowledge of what the ring is. We know why it's important, and we know what's going to happen over the next 3,000 years. But no one in Middle-earth did. Don't forget, the One Ring was forged by Sauron alone and in secret, thousands of years before Isildur was even born. There was no tutorial explaining that Sauron's power would endure so long as his ring did, and no way of knowing that his ring would master any who tried to use it. Both Elrond Half-Elven and Círdan the Shipwright, two of the wisest guys ever to live in Middle-earth, did counsel Isildur to destroy the One Ring, and it certainly would have been better if he did, although, as we've established, it would have been impossible. But even with their gifts of foresight and their stunning perspicacity, they didn't know Sauron was going to rise again, and they didn't know the true nature of the ring. No one did. Secondly, it's not like Isildur kept the One Ring out of greed or out of a wicked lust for power. He didn't take it because he was corrupted. He took it in an attempt to make things right. He took it, in his own words, as a weregild. Now, weregild is not a word that Tolkien invented. It's an ancient Germanic term used by the real-world Anglo-Saxons. What it literally means is man price. And I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone, Tolkien was the professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University. First and foremost, the man was an academic expert in their language and their literature and their customs. Anyway, under this ancient Germanic law, a weregild was basically financial compensation. In other words, blood money. It would be paid to the family or clan of someone who'd just been murdered, and it would be paid by the person or kin of that person who'd committed the murder. Effectively, it was a way of reducing revenge killings. However, because we're talking about a historical culture, there was absolutely no concept of equality when it came to determining how much a person's life was worth. If you murder a Welshman, for example, who doesn't even have any land, you're not going to be paying very much. If you murder a prosperous Englishman, on the other hand, that's different. Murder a bishop or an alderman and you'll be paying out a fortune. Murder a king, and the weregild would be stupendous. And Sauron killed multiple kings. When Isildur cut the ring from his finger, Sauron had just finished slaying Elendil, the High King of the Dunedain, and Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor. And not long before that, King Anarion of Gondor, that's Isildur's brother, was also slain by Sauron's war machines. And prior to that, Sauron brought ruin to Isildur's homeland of Númenor. He human-sacrificed many faithful Númenorians, he conquered Isildur's city of Minas Ithil, burned 2 white trees, and he robbed Isildur of his father and his brother. Isildur took that ring by right of weregild, and there was no one in Middle-earth with a greater claim to do so than him. And the point of claiming the weregild is that now justice is done. The Dunedain have suffered enormously at Sauron's hand, but now there is closure and restitution and an opportunity for peace, at least in theory. Again, we know that the One Ring is actually not particularly conducive to peace and prosperity, but there's no way Isildur could have known that. Yes, I completely agree. It would have been better if the ring had been destroyed, as Círdan and Elrond counselled, but I think it's important to establish Isildur was not being unreasonable in claiming a weregild for his dead father and brother, the dead kings of Arnor and Gondor. And my final and most important point in the end, Isildur totally did agree to give up the ring. In the end, he perceived that Elrond and Círdan were right. Isildur could have stayed in Gondor and tried his best to master the One Ring, but he didn't. He could have headed to Arnor and taken up the kingship there, ruling as the Ring Lord of the North, but he didn't. Instead, Isildur set out for Rivendell. And when he did so, he declared this about the ring. "I dread the pain of touching it. My pride has fallen. It should go to the keepers of the three." AKA Elrond and Círdan, and also Galadriel. That's why Isildur was following the Anduin River into the north. That's what brought him to the Gladden Fields, where he met his tragic end, and the ring was lost in the Anduin. He was trying to get to Rivendell. Only 2 years after ignoring Elrond and Círdan's counsel, Isildur changed his mind. Before the end of his life, he totally did share the wisdom of the wisest guys in Middle-earth. He knew the ring was bad news. He knew it would only bring further ruin to his people. He wanted to be rid of it. Now, in all honesty, I think it's quite unlikely that he actually would have succeeded in giving up the ring if he'd survived and made it to Rivendell. As we've established, the ring won't let itself be given up by its bearer, but we can't blame Isildur for that. So yeah, I stand by my point. At his best, Isildur was epic. At his worst, he barely did anything wrong. But just before I move on to the next misconception, I have one more tangent to go off on. Because while I was saying all of that about how no one could ever give up the ring willingly, you may very well have been thinking, well, what about Bilbo? In the Shadow of the Past chapter, Gandalf tells Frodo, "The ring's keeper never abandons it. At most he plays with the idea of handing it on to someone else's care, but as far as I know, Bilbo alone in history has ever gone beyond playing and really done it." Which is a very cool fact about Bilbo. And I think it helps to remember that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end because he began his ownership of the ring with pity. Prior to Bilbo, every other bearer of the One Ring acquired it through an act of violence against its former owner. However, even with that said, did Bilbo give up the ring? I mean, really? Freely? Did he hand it on to someone else's care? Well, if we examine exactly what happened in that moment when Bilbo and the One Ring part ways, I think we'll find that it's not actually that straightforward. So, in the first chapter of The Lord of the Rings, Bilbo puts the One Ring into an envelope and he tries to walk out of Bag End with it still in his pocket. Gandalf gets cranky about it, they argue, they both calm down, and eventually Bilbo agrees, yes, he must give up the ring. He walks to the mantelpiece with the envelope in his hand, but just as he was about to set it by the clock, his hand jerked back, and the packet fell on the floor. Before he could pick it up, the wizard stooped and seized it and set it in its place. A spasm of anger passed swiftly over the hobbit's face again. Suddenly it gave way to a look of relief and a laugh. So, yes, Bilbo did give up the ring in the sense that his spasm of anger passed and he didn't, fight Gandalf to get it back. But in the sense of freely transferring the ring from his possession to the mantelpiece, by extension to Frodo's possession, no. Bilbo doesn't give it up. At the very last moment, his hand jerks back and the ring falls onto the floor. He reaches down to reclaim it, but then Gandalf intervenes. He's the one who actually sets the ring upon the mantelpiece. And this may seem like a minor point, but technically, the ring isn't so much given up by Bilbo as it is peacefully taken from him by gravity and by Gandalf. and by chance, if chance it were. And even much later in the story, when Samwise Gamgee is in the Tower of Cirith Ungol and he returns the One Ring to his master Frodo after keeping it safe for him, Sam intends to give it up, but when the moment comes to actually transfer the One Ring to his master, he hesitates and he feels reluctance. He suggests that Frodo should let him keep it for a bit. Perhaps they could share the burden. When Frodo hears this, he cries out and he snatches the ring and its chain from Sam's hand. So, again, I'm not saying this to in any way diminish Sam, but technically, he also doesn't so much give up the ring as he has it taken from him, as it was taken from Isildur by the River Anduin. There are moments when Frodo offers the ring to other people, Gandalf, Aragorn, Galadriel, but if any of them had actually taken Frodo up on his offer, I find it highly unlikely that he would have been able to willingly give the ring over when push came to shove. And he's like the most incorruptible guy ever. It just can't be done. I guess there is one exception to this, and that would be Tom Bombadil. The ring seems to have no effect on him, the rules don't even apply to him, but he is such an enigma in every way, and I feel like the cardinal sin of Tom Bombadil is working too hard to try and explain him. If you're forcing him into something that makes sense, I think you're missing the point. Anyway, I feel like I probably belabored this enough. All of this is to say, Isildur did nothing wrong. Misconception number 2. What are the Two Towers? Now, this is a question that I briefly tackled in my earlier Misconceptions video, but I didn't go into much detail, and there's actually quite a lot of important information that I missed. The very last thing I want to do in a video all about misconceptions is lend a hand in spreading more misconceptions, so here is an in-depth answer to what you might think is a very simple question. But it's not. Tolkien actually gave us 5 separate towers to choose from, so which 2 are the official 2? Well, first, and least controversial, I think, there's Orthanc, the Tower of Saruman in Isengard. What we call the Two Towers is effectively 2 separate books published in one volume, and the first of these 2 books is all about Aragorn and Gandalf, and Legolas and Gimli and Merry and Pippin and the Ents and the Men of Rohan, all coming into conflict with Isengard and its central tower of Orthanc. The book ends with all of those characters uniting at Isengard and confronting and subsequently overcoming Saruman in Orthanc. I don't think there's any ambiguity about it. One of the titular 2 towers is Orthanc. But what is the other one? Well, the second book in the Two Towers, that tells an entirely different story, with entirely different characters, none of whom were in the previous book. The second half of the Two Towers is the story of Frodo and Sam and Gollum and the Ring. It's their journey towards the Black Gate, their encounter with Faramir in Ithilien, their journey towards Minas Morgul, and their encounter with Shelob in the pass of Cirith Ungol. At the end, Frodo is stung and carried off by orcs, Sam takes the ring to keep it safe, and the story ends on the ultimate cliffhanger sentence. Frodo was alive, but taken by the enemy. However, within the pages of that Frodo, Sam, Gollum story, no one actually ever sets foot inside any tower. But multiple towers are featured. So, in addition to Saruman's Tower of Orthanc, which other tower is the Two Towers referring to? Well, obviously, in Peter Jackson's films, this is a non-issue. The Two Towers are Orthanc and Barad-dûr, Sauron's tower. And from an adaptation perspective, that makes perfect sense to me. But when it comes to what Tolkien wrote, this is where things get kinda controversial. On the one hand, there is a clearly stated answer. The only problem is on the other hand, where there's a different, clearly stated answer. So, in the official published Lord of the Rings, at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, there's a little note which reads, "Here ends the first part of the history of the War of the Ring. The second part is called The Two Towers, since the events recounted in it are dominated by Orthanc, the citadel of Saruman, and the fortress of Minas Morgul, that guards the secret entrance to Mordor." And also, when The Two Towers was first published, Tolkien himself illustrated his own design for the front cover, which is still used by many publications to this day. And in that hand-drawn design, Tolkien clearly illustrates Orthanc on one side of the page, and Minas Morgul, identified by its symbol of a crescent moon, on the other side. So, I guess, there you go. Tolkien said the Two Towers are Orthanc and Minas Morgul. Where's the ambiguity? Well, the truth is, Tolkien didn't really like that name, The Two Towers. He was pretty resistant to using it for the middle part of his Lord of the Rings saga. You see, Tolkien understood that despite what his publishers were insisting, the story he'd created, The Lord of the Rings, was not a trilogy. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings is made up of 6 books, and what we call the middle part of that trilogy, The Two Towers, is in fact books 3 and 4 glued together. If Tolkien had had his way, these 6 books would all be published together in one enormous volume, which is how The Lord of the Rings is sometimes published nowadays. And each of those 6 books would have had its own name. Book 3 would have very neatly been called The Treason of Isengard, and Book 4 would have been called either The Ring Goes East or The Journey of the Ringbearers. But Tolkien didn't get his way. Instead, his 6 books were glued into 3. Or perhaps you could say, his one enormous tome got sliced into 3. Either way, he was forced to come up with a title for his middle volumes, for books 3 and 4 combined. And this was tricky because books 3 and 4 have nothing in common, really, when lumped together but cut off from the rest of the 6. They share no characters, they share no locations, they are telling completely separate parts of a much wider story. In letter 140, Tolkien wrote to his publishers, "The Two Towers gets as near as possible to finding a title to cover the widely divergent books 3 and 4, and can be left ambiguous. It might refer to Isengard and Barad-dûr, or to Minas Tirith and Barad-dûr, or to Isengard and Cirith Ungol." So, from this private piece of correspondence, it seems Tolkien was hoping to keep the question of the Two Towers ambiguous, and he gives a few different tower combinations that he imagined a reader might come up with. Very interestingly, though, you'll notice that Minas Morgul, the official second tower, is not one of the towers that Tolkien puts forward as an example, which is weird. Furthermore, in letter 143, when Tolkien was pressed to, pin down a more definite set of 2 towers, Tolkien replied, "I'm not at all happy about the title, The Two Towers. It must, if there is any real reference, refer to Orthanc and the Tower of Cirith Ungol. But since there is so much made of the basic opposition of the Dark Tower and Minas Tirith, this seems very misleading." Huh. So, according to Tolkien, Cirith Ungol was the second tower, and once again, he makes no mention of Minas Morgul. Now, I don't know exactly what caused Tolkien to change his mind here and end up drawing Minas Morgul instead of Cirith Ungol on the front cover, but it might have something to do with the fact that although the hobbits do pass through the tunnel of Cirith Ungol through Shelob's lair towards the end of the Two Towers, we don't visit the actual tower of Cirith Ungol until the beginning of Book 6, which is published as the second half of The Return of the King. So it was a curious choice. And also, Frodo and Sam aren't really aware that there even is a Tower of Cirith Ungol on the other side of the Pass of the Spider. But after the taming of Smeagol and the passage through the Dead Marshes, it is the journey towards, and then secret climb away from, Minas Morgul, which defines a great deal of Book 4, The Ring Goes East, or The Journey of the Ringbearers. But, as Tolkien said, the perpetual conflict between the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr and the White Tower of Minas Tirith is also a defining part of the story. And in the very chapter where Gollum first mentions the Tower of Black Sorcery, Minas Morgul, he and Frodo and Sam are all camped in front of two more towers called Narcost and Carcost, the towers of the teeth that stand on either side of the Black Gate. Now, I'm not suggesting that they are supposed to be the two towers, but Tolkien's right. It is confusing. There are a lot more than two towers in this part of the story. Do you think anyone ever suggested calling the middle volume simply The Hand and the Eye? Like The Lord of the Rings, Part 2, The Hand and the Eye. I'm not claiming that's a particularly clever solution, it just seems quite an obvious suggestion to me. I wonder if anyone ever put that forward. Anyway, before I move on to the next misconception, in case you were wondering, the names of the other 4 books in Tolkien's 6th-book Lord of the Rings were Book 1, The Ring Sets Out, in which Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin leave the Shire. They spend time with Tom Bombadil, encounter Barrow Wights at the Barrow Downs, they meet Aragorn in the Prancing Pony, they get chased by the Black Riders, and then eventually Frodo hastens away from Weathertop towards the fords of Bruinen, where the Ringwraiths are washed away by the magical flood of Elrond and Gandalf. Book 2 was going to be called either The Ring Goes South or simply The Fellowship of the Ring. And in this book, the Fellowship of the Ring is formed. They leave Rivendell, they pass through Moria, they lose Gandalf, they come to Lothlorien, and then in the last chapter, the Fellowship breaks, and Frodo departs to Mordor with Sam as his only companion. Book 3 is The Treason of Isengard, Book 4 is The Ring Goes East, or The Journey of the Ringbearers, and Book 5 was going to be called The War of the Ring. Just like in Book 3, The Treason of Isengard, neither Frodo nor Sam nor Gollum nor the Ring appear. In Book 5, it's all about Pippin's experience of the Siege of Gondor, and Merry's time with the Riders of Rohan, and Aragorn's quest with the dead men of Dun Harrow. At the end of Book 5, Aragorn and his army march on the Black Gate and fight one last battle. And then finally, Book 6 was going to be called either The Return of the King or The End of the Third Age. It immediately jumps back to Frodo and Sam's storyline, and it picks up with them in the Tower of Cirith Ungol. It tells of their journey towards Mount Doom, and then in only its 3rd chapter, the ring is destroyed. Sauron is overthrown, and the war is won. And then, Book 6 keeps going for another 6 chapters, some of my favourite chapters, honestly, in which the hobbits return home from their world-changing adventure, and they find that the Shire is not at all how they left it. Now, I know this may sound like another one of those, well, technically, sort of misconceptions, but I really don't think this is. The trilogy, in air quotes, that is The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King is iconic, for sure, but it's not how Tolkien intended for his story to be read. The Lord of the Rings was written as 6 books, each one with its own distinct identity and its own relatively self-contained story, but all of them published together as 6 parts of one enormously epic narrative. Misconception number 3. Goblins are made from corrupted dwarves. So, I'd never actually heard this misconception until I started making Tolkien YouTube videos, but I've now seen quite a few people suggest that orcs come from corrupted elves, uruks come from corrupted men, and goblins come from corrupted dwarves. But this is not the case. The origins of orcs in general is very mysterious, and Tolkien never quite settled on a version that he was entirely happy with, and a number of different orc origins are put forward in a few different writings penned over Tolkien's lifetime. In the very earliest Middle-earth writings, going back, well over 100 years now, we are told the first orcs were not corrupted out of any pre-existing race, instead they were made out of the earth, out of subterranean heats and slime, and their hearts were of granite. Relatively soon after that, Tolkien also wrote, "The hordes of orcs Melkor," that's the original Dark Lord, Sauron's former boss, "made of stone, but their hearts of hatred." However, that was over 100 years ago. In the decades that followed, Tolkien made major revisions. And in the Annals of Aman, which he wrote in the 1950s, so that's after The Lord of the Rings, we are given the version that I imagine most people are familiar with. In that version, Tolkien wrote the elves that came into the hands of Melkor were put in prison, and by slow arts of cruelty and wickedness were corrupted and enslaved. Thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the Orcor, in envy and mockery of the elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes. However, there is still more to it. In a note in the margin of those Annals of Aman, Tolkien wrote, "Alter this. Orcs are not elvish." And in later revisions, Tolkien did indeed alter this. In an essay called Myths Transformed, he wrote, "It became clear in time that undoubted men could, under the domination of Melkor or his agents, in a few generations be reduced almost to the orc level of mind and habits. And then they would or could be made to mate with the orcs." What a horrible mental image. Producing new breeds, often larger and more cunning. There is no doubt that long afterwards, in the Third Age, Saruman rediscovered this, or learned of it in lore, and in his lust for mastery committed this, his wickedest deed, the interbreeding of orcs and men, producing both men orcs large and cunning, and orc men, treacherous and vile. Furthermore, in the Unfinished Tales, Tolkien tells us, "Doubtless Melkor, since he can make no living thing, bred orcs from various kinds of men." Now, as I say, there is no official version of orc origins, and for the characters of Middle-earth, as well as for the reader, the question of how orcs came into being is a horrifying mystery. We just know that they did. However, although there is quite a bit of ambiguity here, there's no version of events where orcs are bred from dwarves. And I don't think that's a coincidence. The truth is, I'd argue, dwarves can't be corrupted into orcs. When the race of dwarves was first created by, of all people, interestingly, Sauron's former teacher, the Valar Aule, they were intentionally endowed by Aule with a much greater resistance to the enemy's dominion than any other race. Dwarves were made specifically to be very, very difficult to corrupt. Obviously, dwarves can totally be manipulated or coerced into self-destructive behavior, and some dwarves totally have aided both Dark Lords on some occasions, but not as orc-like thralls, never as corrupted slaves. And we can see this with the example of Sauron and his rings of power. About halfway through the Second Age, Sauron had 16 rings of power to give away as gifts. 9 of them he gave to mortal men, and every single one of them was corrupted into a ring wraith, bound to the will of Sauron and enslaved by their ring. But the other 7 rings he gave to dwarves, and as I'm sure you're aware, there are no miniature dwarf-sized Nazgul. The rings absolutely did have some negative effects. They stoked this kind of gold lust in their bearers, which went on to have terrible consequences, but they absolutely failed to bind the dwarf lords in the way that the 9 rings bound the Nazgul. And so, even though on a small number of rare occasions some wicked dwarves may have fought alongside orcs in the service of Mordor, for example in the War of the Last Alliance, where we know they fought on both sides, I'm confident there would never have been any little orcs that were bred or corrupted from dwarves. Dwarven wills just can't be dominated like that. And while I'm on the topic of little orcs, there's another misconception that I want to briefly touch on. Because, contrary to what's often the case in other fantasy worlds, in Middle-earth, goblins are not a separate subspecies of orc. I know that in adaptations, the smaller subterranean orcs of the Misty Mountains are often referred to as goblins, while the bigger, stronger orcs of Isengard are often referred to as Uruks. But in Tolkien's writings, the difference between orcs and Uruks and goblins is much more linguistic than scientific. I guess it's kind of like talking about the difference between human beings, Homo sapiens, and mankind. You know, there is of course an enormous amount of variety among separate groups and separate individuals. All people are different, but those differences do not sync up with those words, human being, Homo sapien, and mankind. And to an extent, it's the same with orcs. Orc and goblin are two separate words in two separate languages for the exact same thing. And a great deal of the time, these words can be used interchangeably. And we can see this in The Hobbit, when Elrond translates the name of Thorin's elvish sword. The narrator tells us in English that this sword is called the Goblin Cleaver, and this is translated into Sindarin as Orc-rist. Orc-rist. Goblin is the English word, orc is the Sindarin word, and Uruk is the word used in the Black Speech of Mordor. Over time, Tolkien significantly reduced his use of the word goblin, favouring instead to use orc throughout later writings. However, I don't want to oversimplify this point. It is true that typically the word Uruk is reserved for the stronger, larger, and more dangerous orc warriors. And even in The Hobbit, where orcs are, in all but 2 examples, referred to as goblins, there is still a reference to goblins, aka your average orc, and hobgoblins, which Tolkien only mentions once but describes as the larger kind. So it would appear, regardless of which language we use, there is a word for the standard orc/goblin, and then there's often another word for the larger, superior Uruk/hobgoblin. Also, there is another word, snaga, which comes from the Black Speech and is used typically in contempt to describe the smaller, weaker orcs. What snaga literally means is slave. However, again, this isn't a different species of orc, it's just an insulting label used by the biggest, strongest orcs to insult the weaker, smaller ones. So you probably would be able to tell a distinct difference between an Uruk and a snaga just by looking at them, but between goblins and orcs? No. In Tolkien's writings, they are simply 2 separate words in 2 separate languages for the exact same creature. Misconception number 4. Gandalf and the Ring of Fire. So, in the very last chapter of The Lord of the Rings, it's revealed that Gandalf has been in possession of a ring of power this whole time. And the ring that Gandalf secretly possesses is called Narya, the Elvish Ring of Fire, the ring that originally belonged to Círdan the Shipwright. Furthermore, during The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, almost all of Gandalf's explicit uses of magic, certainly as Gandalf the Grey, are fire magic. And so it makes perfect sense, right? Gandalf's magical ring of fire is what's giving him his fire-based magical powers. However, as obvious as that totally does seem, it is, I believe, a misconception. In the Second Age, mighty Celebrimbor of Eregion forged 3 rings of power independently of Sauron, and thus those 3 elvish rings were untouched by the Dark Lord's malice. Now, these 3 rings, the rings of fire, water, and air, do all have magical properties. They do bestow power upon those who bear them, but those powers have nothing to do with the elements for which the rings are named. Fire, water, and air are references to the colours of the gemstones set inside each ring, and in the case of Narya, the stone upon it was red as fire. But the powers of Narya relate to fire only metaphorically. Its magic is wrapped up in the inspiring of others to resist tyranny. It provides fortitude during times of weariness. In the words of Círdan himself, the ring of fire rekindles hearts in a world that grows chill. However, what it does not do is give its bearer the power to, summon fireballs, just as the rings of water and air don't bestow any kind of elemental abilities upon their owners. However, Gandalf does summon fire quite a few times. He uses it in battle in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and even when he's, relaxing with hobbits, still he is intimately associated with smoke rings and colourful sparks and of course fireworks. So, if not from his Ring of Power, where does the fiery flavour of Gandalf's magic come from? Well, to give a short and simple answer, I think it comes from Gandalf himself. Of the three wizards that we know anything substantial about, all of them have a specific magical genre that they work within. Saruman is very skilled in law and industry, but most of his actual magic comes from his persuasive voice. And in The Lord of the Rings, we're told that Radagast is a master of shapes and a changer of hues, which is very open to interpretation, but it implies to me some sort of ability to pass by unseen, potentially with shape-shifting illusions. We could speculate for days on Saruman and Radagast's full magical potential, but I think the power of the voice and the changing of hues, respectively, would be at the centre of what they can do. And in Gandalf's case, his magic is predominantly fire-based. Although it is worth pointing out, he does also manipulate water at the fords of Bruinen when he adds the horse-like shapes to the Great Flood that washes away the Nazgul. Nevertheless, I think these powers of Gandalf's are totally separate from the powers of the ring that he carries, and the fact that Narya is the red ring, named the Ring of Fire, is, in my mind, simply a coincidence. Let's say Círdan the Shipwright had been the keeper of Vilya instead, that's the Ring of Air, and that he'd bestowed Vilya to Gandalf in place of Narya. I think Gandalf's fire powers would remain exactly the same. Maybe he would have slightly less powers of inspiration, because he wouldn't have Narya, and maybe he'd have slightly better powers of healing, that's what Vilya's associated with, but I don't think Gandalf would have turned into, an airbender with Vilya. That's just not how the Rings of Power work. Misconception number 5. What shape are an elf's ears? I've heard it said Tolkien never described any of his elves as ever having pointy ears, and he never gave us any reason to imagine that elvish ears would be anything other than just like yours or mine. But this is, I think, a bit of a misconception within a misconception. It is absolutely true, Tolkien never described any of his elves as having pointy ears. He never described the elvish race as having unusual ears, and it is for the most part thanks to non-Tolkien influences that we so often imagine Middle-earth's elves with pointy ears. However, deep inside some of Tolkien's linguistic essays, we are actually given a clue about how he imagined the shape of elvish ears. So, around 1937, Tolkien was documenting the etymological roots of various elvish words, because, first and foremost, he was a language nerd. And in those etymologies, he tells us that the elvish word las means leaf in Sindarin, as in Legolas, green leaf. And then, in the next entry on the list, we are told the elvish word for ear is lasse. And Tolkien tells us that these words, las and lasse, leaf and ear, may be related, for the elvish ears were more pointed and leaf-shaped than human. So, although nothing is certain here, we do have enough evidence, I think, to be confident that yes, Tolkien's elves do have at least slightly pointed and leaf-shaped ears. What kind of leaf, though? Well, that is still up for debate. I imagine any reasonable person would say, like, a normal leaf. But there are lots of leaf shapes out there, and though it would be a pretty radical departure from the general consensus, you are technically free to imagine elves with any number of bizarrely shaped ears. And as long as you can find that shape on some leaf somewhere in nature, no one can tell you you're wrong. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching this video. I hope you learned something, or if not, at least enjoyed hearing things you already know. And if you did enjoy it, be sure to hit like and leave a comment and hit subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss any future videos coming soon. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevair Melanin.